Barney Greatrex, From Bomber Command to the French Resistance, the stirring story of an Australian hero. Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
Survival was the rule of the day.
My jaw was broken. I could feel my molars in the centre of
We weren't
my
out there to
mouth.
take country. We were out there
At the end of the day, everyone
That was their job.
wearing green is a soldier.
Lost communication.
Getting yourself blown up does some interesting things to you.
Yeah.
A place like the Middle East is constantly
There is
changing.
quite a pressure
What we
when
do
you
there
deploy
is
and
constantly
you-
changing.
We killed
And
Dave.
the thing was our own minefield. He held me up with a broken whiskey bottle and machete.
Battle for Australia.
Today I'm talking about the biography of World War II veteran Barney Greatrex, written by Michael Veitch based on the research by Alex Lloyd and Angus Horton. This book was inspired by the documentary miniseries For School and Country by Thistle Productions, the makers of this podcast. We collaborated with publisher Hachette and best-selling author Michael Veitch to produce this awesome account of Barney's life. This is the back cover blurb. The incredible untold World War II story of Australian hero Barney Greatrex, from bomber command to French resistance fighter. A school and university cadet in Sydney, Barney Greatrex signed up for RAF Bomber Command in 1941, eager to get straight into the very centre of the Allied counterattack. Bombing Germany night after night, Barney's 61 Squadron faced continual enemy fighter attacks and anti-aircraft fire. Death or capture by the Nazis loomed large. Very few survived more than 20 missions, and it was on his 20th mission in 1944 that Barney's luck finally ran out. He was shot down over occupied France. But his war was far from over. Rescued by the French resistance, Barney seized the opportunity to carry on fighting and join the Marquis in the liberation of France from the occupied German forces, who rarely took prisoners. Later, Barney was awarded the French Legion of Honour, but for 70 years he said almost nothing of his incredible war service, surviving two of the most dangerous battlefronts. Now, age 97, Barney Greatrex has revealed his truly great Australian war story to acclaimed best-selling author Michael Veitch. So that's the book. It's out now in print and ebook format where all good books are found. You can find out more about it on our website, www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com, where you can also check out the documentary that inspired the book. I spoke with the author, Michael Veitch, on this podcast. Go back a couple of weeks and look for the episode Australian Airmen's Untold Stories with Michael Veitch for the full conversation. And most importantly, grab your copy of the book today for yourself, for a Christmas present, you name it. It's an amazing story. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget. Barney Greatrex is the biography of World War II veteran Barney Greatrex, written by best-selling author Michael Veitch based on the research by myself and Angus Horton. This podcast is a highlights compilation from the book launch held at Knox Grammar School on 8 November 2017. There are a few speakers, including quite an entertaining in-conversation between myself and Michael Veitch, if I do say so myself. Enjoy. A very special welcome for the man of the hour from the class of 1939. Would you please put your hands together for Barney Greatrex? My name is Alex Lloyd. I'm from the class of 2009, so Barney and I went to school together just a few years apart. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of Barney's biography written by Michael Veitch. Barney Greatrex, From Bomber Command to the French Resistance, the stirring story of an Australian hero. This book was first inspired by a documentary miniseries called For School and Country, which was made by Thistle Productions, led by myself and Angus Horton. And that documentary came out at Knox a couple of years ago, and it chronicled the World War II service of 12 Knox old boys, including Barney and also here today, John Reed. Once that documentary was done, Angus and I knew there was something particularly compelling and unique about Barney's story, that we had to get it out there to the wider world. So we took the story to Matthew Kelly, non-fiction publisher at Hachette, a major international book publisher, and he loved it and saw a vision for the book, and he introduced us to Michael Veitch. And I'll be chatting to Michael in a little bit, but first I'd like to welcome, to formally launch the book, it is the headmaster, Mr. John Weeks.
And so they'll read this story of a young boy who, just like them, went to school here, Sydney-based, ends up, because of world circumstances, in the Air Force, ends up being shipped out to the UK, ends up becoming a bomb aimer. Who'd ever heard of a bomb aimer? Well, we've got a bomb aimer here with us. Then we find that, tragically, he's shot down, and the other members of that Lancaster bomber perish, but he walks away. He then ends up with the French resistance for over 8 months on the run and involved with them and their activities in occupied France. Finally, hitches a ride back to the UK when the liberation takes place, and then home to his parents and family, who thought that he was lost and perished all those months before. It's one man's journey, I know, amidst a world of turmoil, but it's a fabulous story. I commend it to you, and I want to thank Barney for sharing it with us. But I do want to congratulate you, Michael, because what I know you've been able to do for us with this story is to contextualise it. What I have learned from a historical perspective about where Barney was, the circumstances under which he had to operate, the people who he met, and what they were aiming to do, is able to be better understood because of the work that Michael has done. And I do want to thank you for that, because I think it's absolutely fabulous that we can see how Barney fits into the greater story that's there. It's really a very readable and relatable story, and Michael's brought that to the fore. And I mean, this came from, yes, as Alex said, the film which they made for the commemoration of the 100th year of Anzac, but it also came from their hearts and their passion to get these stories out. And this book is now officially not in the Lancaster bomber anymore, but she's launched, and may it fly really, really well. Thank you all for being here.
And to introduce our next speaker is Angus Horton.
We wish to acknowledge the great contribution and thanks that go to his family for so lovingly trusting and sharing all this wonderful information of Barney's, without which we wouldn't have been able to have this wonderful book. So I would like to welcome Charlie Mort, who is going to be speaking shortly on behalf of Barney. And Charlie is so very important because in 2013, he took his son, and more importantly, he took Barney, who was then 93 years of age, back to France. And you've seen these wonderful photos that have been peeling over behind us. And Charlie took some amazing photos. There's one in particular of Barney looking over the grave of his fellow crew members. And we'll never understand what must be going through his mind. But once again, we would like to acknowledge the contribution that Charlie has made, and in particular Barney, in producing this amazing book. And this book is so important because it demonstrates the triumph of the human spirit, that despite overwhelming odds, especially in Barney's case, good can and will prevail.
My son Angus and I had the incredible honour of going to France with Barney in 2013 at 93 years of age. Barney was very happy to make the journey back to a place that is so dear to his heart. There's no doubting the traumatic events of 1944 that Barney endured meant that he came home a very different man to the uni student that left Australia determined to do his duty. Angus and I got the chance to visit where his bomber crashed and retraced his journey from there down to La Bresse in the Vosges Mountains. We visited the Commonwealth graves, the Commonwealth War Cemetery near Nancy, where his crewmates are all buried. They were all in their 20s. Barney's life before the war was very near here in Pymble, as well as right here at Knox. And after the war, he was back again. Back here, back to his loving family and friends. Barney, I try to imagine what this must have been like for you. Coming back to this wonderful, safe, loving part of the world, the events of late 43 to late 44 must have seemed a bit surreal. Looking back through the prism of life in Pymble and the North Shore. Up till now, I've never really felt like there was an appropriate time or place to thank you on a number of levels. On a personal family level, I thank you for being such a kind and humble uncle. But in the context of why we're here, I would like to thank you so much, Barney, as well as your long-departed crewmates, for what you did to keep us safe. Wally Ineson, Reg Gill, Alan Collins, Maury Worth, Alan Jones, Paddy Rankin and Barney. I like to believe that the telling of the story is as much an honour to the memory of your crew mates as it is an honour to you. So Barney, from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of us all here today, I thank you so very much.
Thank you, Charlie. And now I would like to welcome the man who has brought Barney's life to the page so wonderfully. Please welcome to the front, Michael Veitch.
Thanks for being here. Look at that, my goodness, there's so many people in this room. Hi. You're hosting this, over to you.
Well, we've heard a lot about Barney's story from the speakers, so I first would like to acknowledge that we are at the place where it all began for Barney, where he first had exposure to military life, Knox Grammar.
Yes, this is where this gentleman, of course, went to school, and it was lucky that he did come to this school at this time. You mentioned Neil McNeill, the first headmaster, a veteran of the First World War who had been through the Battle of Lewes. Now, the Battle of Lewes was sort of the really first particularly horrible battle for the British of the First World War. So he actually saw how ghastly it was. Lewes was a disaster. It was the first one they realised, oh heck, this is not going to be what we thought it was. This is just going to be a mess. And Lewes was a mess. I think something like, it was early in the war in 1915, the British lost something like, out of regiments comprising 10,000 men, they had 8,000 casualties in about 4 hours. So the man was imbued with the notion of how awful war was, and I think, ironically, that's what he imbued into the school culture here in the 20s and 30s, when he realised, rather presciently, and a lot of people didn't, that another war was inevitable. I think his acknowledgement that if you're going to have another generation going into the more of battle, I want them to train for it, unlike what I saw when I was about 22 years old and seeing all these people cut down, not knowing what they were doing. The stories of Lewes are just so awful. Bewildered young men in their hundreds, not knowing where to go, insufficiently trained and being mowed down. And I'm sure he did not want that to happen again. So that's one of the reasons that the boys at the time, like Barney, were caught up in this military training, which was quite intensive. They had lots of sort of associations with the Australian Army to get the most realistic sort of training that it was possible to get. And Barney acknowledged that stood him very, very well. He didn't find it as hard when he was on the ground. He, of course, joined the Air Force for a terrific reason, because he thought he'd survive. Ironically, he thought he'd have a higher chance of surviving. I'll get to that in a sec. But when he was on the ground, after being shot down, he actually kept thinking of his training back here and how much it actually had helped him. And because young men of that time were so imbued with how awful the First War had been, so many joined the Air Force thinking that's the best place to survive a war. But unfortunately, it was reversed by the Second World War, and the Air Force was the most dangerous by 1,000,000 miles of the services to be in, particularly for most of the airmen who trained in Australia, because the bulk of them went to Europe to fly in Bomber Command, like Barney. The chances of surviving a tour, you only had to do 30 missions or trips, as they call them, at various stages of the Second World War, particularly the bulk of the middle part. The chances of surviving a tour in Bomber Command was 1 in 3 and sometimes 1 in 4. But being in a bomber crew in Bomber Command was incredibly dangerous. They were all volunteers, they were all highly trained. Inevitably, 2/3 the way through Barney's tour, he was shot down by a German night fighter and came down almost on the French-German border. In fact, he remembers walking back across this sort of barbed wire in the middle of the night. There's all this barbed wire and this sort of gateway and the pillbox where thank goodness nobody was, and it was the French-German border. So he basically, when his training kicked in and he'd been told, if you're on the ground and in a village somewhere and you want to approach someone, pick the last house in the street, because if they're unfriendly, at least you can duck back into the forest. And that's exactly what he did. And so he virtually appeared as this sort of dishevelled, uniformed wraith in the middle of this Frenchman's lounge room late one night, early one evening, because I think it was as dusk was coming. And he'd been observing this village for a day or two and said, I'll pick that house there. And thank goodness they had connections with the French resistance. So then began the second part of this extraordinary ordeal when he was on the ground in the resistance. I'll let you ask some questions. I won't just
I would like to acknowledge, though, you called Neil McNeil prescient. I would put Barney up there as prescient as well, because he looked at the situation and thought, most likely I'll get sent to Bomber Command. If I get sent to Bomber Command, most likely we'll be in a Lancaster. Looks up the schematics of a Lancaster. Oh, the bomb aimer. He's on top of the escape hatch. That sounds good. That might be useful. Came in handy on the 20th mission. So then Barney survives and reaches that last house in the village, as Michael says, and he goes through some mix of great hardship and some also truly comedic moments. I was wondering if you could tell us the story in the restaurants.
Yes. Well, this is in the first couple of days after Barney's arrival, shall we say. He was immediately given a cover identity of a deaf and dumb French mechanic. Now, what use a deaf and dumb French mechanic would actually be, Barney, I'm actually not sure. However, as he was being sort of worked out what they do with him, his minders sort of took him to various places. It was in a French cafe quite on a busy day, and of course the whole place had been occupied by the Germans, so the Germans were everywhere. And his minder, who didn't speak very good English at all, sort of sat him down in a restaurant and immediately saw someone out the window that he had to talk to, so he bolted out again. Meanwhile, the waitress came up to him and started saying, in French, your order, sir, what is your order? But he didn't speak a word of French. And this girl became more and more agitated and saying, what is your order? And was saying, as waitresses do, with a pad and paper. Next to him was a table full of German officers in uniform. And all that had to happen was for their attention to be caught, because they were all trained in France to be on the lookout for things like, for suspects. They were trained to be actually on the lookout for people who were inexplicably mute, because of course that was the cover, and it was incredibly unlikely. But and I think Barney recalls just a flicker of an interest in this German officer beginning to look around at this kerfuffle, and all he had to do was put 2 and 2 together, and if he was challenged, that would have been it. He would have been shocked. He was out of uniform and an enemy combatant. There was no questions. He would have lasted a week. He would have gone to the Gestapo, and that would have been the end of it. All within the Geneva Convention, by the way. That was actually perfectly legitimate to do. Thank goodness the fellow came back just in time to sort of wrest this situation away from disaster. But there were so many more disasters Barney managed to avert. I mean, about 9 lives. This fellow had 90 lives, and he managed to sort of evade the untimely demise of all of them. There were all sorts of things. So one of the most tragic is when, much later, when, as part of the resistance, they were hiding in the woods in this sort of winter cottage because they had to get away from the Germans. They knew the Germans were starting to infiltrate back into this area of Alsace-Lorraine in the Vosges Mountains because the Germans were planning to make a last stand there to protect the flank of the American armies. It gets sort of military history complicated. American armies are coming up from the south of France and they were going to push through to get to the heart of Germany, Augsburg and all these big important cities. So the Germans decided we're going to make a stand in this natural ridge of mountains that run to the kind of east of Alsace-Lorraine. So the Germans were starting to come back into all this area. Meanwhile, all these resistance cells were sort of dotted up into the mountains and were basically hiding there. But occasionally they had to come back into the towns to get supplies. And one of these supply trips, Barney and his minder came down into the town. They skied down the mountains, and at night did a had a very quick sort of shopping trip and a doctor's trip to check them up. So they went to the doctor, and he checked Barney out. Checked out it was Bebert, wasn't it? That he was with. Yeah, his French resistance minder. Then went to do some shopping, and then they came back to the doctor and he said, "Look, good luck. You know, you're all okay, but just I haven't had much news from outside. Tell your men they'll be called upon very soon," as indeed they were, "but just stay put for the moment." And they went back to the mountain. The very next morning, that doctor was arrested by the Gestapo and shot. Not the next morning, but it was. I think Barney was quite traumatised for a while because they thought that it was partly his arrest was associated with his visit. It turned out it was not. The Germans were after him anyway because he'd been assisting the resistance for a long time. One of the great thousands of heroic stories of the French resistance during the Second World War. All sorts of other, this close encounter with, much later in the piece where they're on the run, what happens is that their Marquis camp got sort of broken up as the Germans sort of pushed back and met a lot of fierce resistance from the unit that Barney was associated with. Luckily, he was away on a scouting mission at the time and witnessed the attack from an adjacent mountain peak, but was not involved in it specifically. But then the camp scattered, and he met. It becomes like a bizarre story involving sort of two wandering British Indian officers from India, having been taken prisoner in the desert 2 years before and in full uniform, terrified of being on the run in France, because it's hard enough for someone like Barney to hide, but if you're an Indian officer, where the hell are you going to hide? They're terrified the Germans were just going to arrest them immediately. An American and a British, it's like walking into a pub joke, isn't it? But they were actually on the run. They were in some barn. They kept going to barns. That's correct. We had to hide in a lot of barns during the Second World War. You did indeed. And there was one point where they were getting up in the morning in this sort of big pile of hay, and on the other side of this sort of fairly thin wall, wooden slatted wall, just slats about that set so you could see movement. You couldn't quite see what was happening. And they realised there was a platoon of German soldiers were literally resting against the wall of this barn that they were in. And they couldn't make a noise because they were literally from here to there away through this sort of slatted wall of this rather dilapidated barn. And they were with a big American officer, Reese, and a Lieutenant Colonel Prendergast, who was part of a mission that they became involved with. I'll get to that second if we have a time. But they just sort of froze in this sort of tableau and hearing all this kerfuffle and hearing the rifles being stacked up against the wall. And then sure enough, a German sort of peers through this and sees an American 6'2" American officer stand there, and then they go to draw their rifles. The American officer walks forward and suddenly vanishes, and he crashes through the floor of this sort of barn where the hole had been in the roof and the floorboards were all rotten, and crashes through to a cellar underneath. The noise terrifies the Germans so much, they all scarper. They all kind of run off. But all that had to do was they would have turned around and open fire with their Schmeiser submachine guns, and that would be it. But there are many, many incidences like that you think, how do you get over the nerves of that? How do you... But just day after day, they had to just sort of carry on. They were in the middle of this. They're in a no man's land of one of these sort of forgotten battles at the end of the French campaign. For some, as luck would have it, the part of France Barney was in was where the Germans held out towards the various months after Paris had been liberated and months after they had been kicked out of the north of France. But in the east, the Germans had decided to have this last battle. And this the village, saw a slide come up of a village called La Bresse, which is a high altitude village in the Vosges Mountains, that the Americans had to get through and the Germans were determined to hold. So as a result, the village was absolutely wrecked. It was just about every house in the village was destroyed. Atrocities were committed on the population who were basically forced marched further up into the mountain snowfields. Many of them perished through exposure. And Barney he wasn't quite witness that because he had been liberated just before that, but that's what he was at the start of. It's an incredible wartime adventure. There's so many chapters to it. I could have written double what I did, but Matthew Kelly wouldn't have allowed me. It would have been too hard to edit, and he wouldn't be able to sell it for the price he's got it out. But
I don't think you need me up here, mate.
Oh, sorry.
But you mentioned Rees and Prendergast.
Yes.
want to talk actually about the sources you used to put the book together, because you have Barney and you have a myriad of other stuff accrued over time by the family and other third parties, but also the Jedburgh reports Barney features in.
Yes, and sorry, you've prompted me to remind everybody that this was indeed a group effort, and your good self, Angus, Charlie, the whole Greatrex family were enormous. I couldn't have done it by myself because when you're digging into an essentially untold story, you have to rely on the largesse of family and people who have a great interest and a great love for the story. And thank you so much for your help. I put the words together, but a lot of the research came from other people. And halfway through the research, I was alerted to the fact that a report on a mission that Barney became caught up with was still in existence. Just a tiny bit of background. When the French, the French resistance was an enormous kind of huge, chaotic, wobbly organisation that was frankly divided often amongst itself as much as it was against the Germans. But what we call the Maquis were the armed wing of the French resistance, who were basically civilians clutching submachine guns that had been dropped from canisters by the British and Americans with very elementary military training. Now, when push came to shove, the British knew that these people were going to be cut down in droves, and unless they had a little bit more training, basic military, wherewithal. So they organised these three-man, very, very slick three-man teams that they codenamed Jedburghs. And there were 100 or so Jedburgh teams dropped with highly trained, multilingual officers speaking the language of the country they were operating in. Most of them were in France, a few in Holland, a couple in Scandinavia, but mainly in France. And Barney met the Jedburgh officers as they arrived to his marquee. There'd been this long delay, and suddenly out of the gloom one night, after going up to their drop area, where they hear the planes coming over, and this big tall American comes out and says, "Hi, how are you going? Have some chewing gum." That's almost what it was like. And this was Rees, who was one of the head of this three-man team. They met Barney and thought, this man is a wonderful asset. He's now speaking the language. He's very intelligent. He's articulate. And he kind of knows the lay of the land and the personalities objectively, and that's what we need. So he became an essential part of this mission that was codenamed Pavot. Okay, so at the end of it, Jedburgh Pavot goes back to England. A report, a fabulously written, beautifully written report by this fellow Prendergast, who was the boss of it. He writes it up. And halfway through the research period, it's alerted to, now how did it come about? I can't remember. Charlie, yeah. you found it, didn't you? Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciated that. Don't say that. You found it up in an archive, fallen behind a cupboard that never been looked in.
I went to London.
Yeah. Good for you. But the report that actually mentions Barney, it was that wonderful confluence of sources all coming together, and it was I didn't need proof, but it was that eureka moment where, yes, it all fits together, and I'm coming from one direction, and there's proof that the track I'm on is correct because this completely other blind source has vindicated what we've all been writing about, and of course, vindicates Barney's story. It didn't need vindication anyway, but that moment of clarity was terrific. And it went on to paint so much colour into the adventure that Barney was involved in. Barney, of course, wrote his own brief account. It's not a big account, but it gave the basics. A lot of French sources as well, because the friendships that Barney made in France lasted his lifetime, have lasted his lifetime, I should say, and multi-generational too.
It's been a remarkable journey. Obviously, Barney's life is a remarkable journey, but it's been quite a journey watching all this come together and see the book come to fruition. And one of the big highlights in recent years was the Legion of Honour last year, which is sort of the lovely final note in the story.
Yes, the French government acknowledged, it took them a long while, it has to be said, but they did acknowledge finally the airmen that had flown over their country during the Second World War, risking their lives. Barney was the only survivor of his aircraft. Thousands, just getting back to the dangers of Bomber Command, 55,000 young men lost their lives in Bomber Command. All highly trained, all expensively trained. That's as many men who were killed as in the whole of the Royal Navy for the entire Second World War. 55,000 young men, just in one section of Royal and Commonwealth Air Forces. That's not the fighters, that's not the transports, that's not the Coastal Command planes, it's just the bombers. So France, yes, acknowledged that it was time to award these men who flew over our country as, I don't like you use the word hero because people like Barney don't like to use the word hero, but to us there's not many other words you can use. And it was wonderful that he had that wonderful acknowledgement of the Legion of Honour from the French government. It meant so much to them, not just to Barney, but to so many of these fellows that I'd spoken to. The Bomber Command men after the war did not have a good time. There's a parallel to what they went through with the fellows who went to Vietnam and came back to find that in many cases what they'd been asked to do by their government had been shunned, and they'd been caught in the middle of this awful kind of politics. A lot of that happened to the Bomber Command people after the Second World War as well. They did, out of all the servicemen, especially in Australia, where there was a kind of a prejudice of people who had fought in Europe as opposed to fighting in the Pacific. But so this is why it was so good that after so many years, things like the Legion of Honour actually happened, and it meant an enormous amount.
Well, it's an amazing life, and it's been remarkably told. Thank you, Michael, for your brilliant work in bringing it to the page.
Thank you.
You can find video and photos from the launch at www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com/book or on our Facebook page. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Life on the Line Podcast and on Twitter at LOTL Pod. Barney Greatrex is out now where all good books are sold. Dymocks, Big W, Booktopia, Book Depository, wherever you shop, on foot or online, it's there. And the ebook is out now on Amazon, iBooks and Kobo. Get it for yourself or a Christmas present. Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of Life on the Line. We have a regularly scheduled bonus episode out tomorrow with the wonderful Hugh Remington. Be sure to tune in. And if you know a veteran serviceman or servicewoman with a story to tell, please get in touch. We would love to have them on the podcast. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget. Welcome to the final bonus episode for Season 1 of Life on the Line. We're closing out this season on a favourite subject of mine, the story of Barney Greatrex. Regular listeners of this podcast will know that Barney Greatrex fought in World War II. He was a bomb aimer for Bomber Command, the sole survivor of his Lancaster being shot down, and then he spent 8 months fighting the Germans with the French resistance in occupied France in 1944. In 2013, his nephew, Charlie Mort, orchestrated an incredible family trip to France to retrace Barney's crash site, the places he went to on his journey, and meeting the relatives of those with whom he fought. 93-year-old Barney was the guest of honour in this epic tour of remembrance. I spoke to Charlie about the trip and how they went about retracing the resistance. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Charlie.
Pleasure, Alex.
So let's go back to your childhood. Did you spend a lot of time with Barney growing up?
Yeah, so if I think way back to small childhood, not as much. I grew up until I was 6 years old in Hunters Hill, and with Mum we used to go and see her mum in St Ives, where Barney and Jenny lived, but he was settled in work. It was basically when I was, so still a fair way back, when I was 6, we moved to the country, and not long after, Barney and Jenny, who were very close to Mum, a block of land came up that was in the back of our farm, which Barney and Jenny decided to buy, and that's been one of the loves of their life ever since. So it was from sort of that point where I really spent a lot more time with Barney, I suppose, from about 6 or 7.
Do you remember when you first learned that Barney had fought in World War II?
I probably heard about it late primary school, early high school, but I don't remember an exact time, but it was pretty vague because they never spoke about it. He never spoke about it at all. Even I can think right through high school and early adulthood, it was never spoken about. Obviously with immediate family, with Jenny, and they had done 1 or 2 trips, him with work, where he probably went back to places once or twice, but never spoke about it. So it was there in the background.
Especially with, you've got both your uncles, Barney and Anthony, as Air Force veterans, and your mother had been a nurse in the war. So it's odd that entire generation serves and then the next just hears so little about it. It's odd, but common.
Yeah. I mean, but I think with the veterans, everyone had a different experience and their own personality of the way they are. My father was in the 9th Division, and he was very social and went to the march every year, and I guess he never even really spoke to us much about what he got up to. It is a bit of a veteran thing. Anyone who's been in war, I don't know whether that's. I think it is pretty common, maybe, that you don't necessarily talk about it too much. I don't know.
So when did that start to change, and Barney did finally start to talk about it with you directly?
I think it was more me over time, and probably into my 30s and 40s maybe, where my interest got a bit piqued as I got older. I'd always be going round to Barney and Jenny's and sitting and having a cup of tea, and more over a decade or 2 I started asking questions, quizzing him about it. And at some stage, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, I saw the story that he had written down after the war. Was amazed by it then. So basically over about the last 15 or 20 years, it became a thing that I really used to question him a lot about it.
And in the past decade or so, he's become a lot more vocal in telling a story. I think he quite enjoys it.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, I grilled him more and more. And then as my parents and Barney and Jenny, as they were getting older, I got much more interested in it, culminating in asking him about getting back over there at some point. So
the 2013 trip is the first real family orientated trip. What's the inspiration behind that to take him over there?
I mean, it was twofold. There was probably a little bit of not selfish, but it was a bit, again, my amazement with his story grew to the point where while he was still capable, I was very keen to go over and see. I couldn't have thought of a better way to go over and see the places where he'd been than with him. A few of the immediate family thought I was a bit courageous to do what I did, and I got sort of warned by a few not to do it, but I was determined. I mean, I was very close to him, and I would be round at his place all the time, mowing the lawns and catching up with him, and I was determined in the end, and he was very keen to go when I put it to him.
Well, yeah, it's September, October 2013, so he's 92, 93. I can imagine the family thinking you're crazy to try and fly him around the world, but good on him for having the stamina to go and not just make the flight, but then trape around France.
Yeah, he's an amazing fellow, because, I mean, maybe this is why he's done so well and he's still pretty good at 97, and I think it was... He's a bit what I would call obsessive compulsive. I think that meant that he was always wanting to be busy. He had his routines at home, and you'd turn up there, he was never inside sitting down. He was always out in the garden or doing stuff. And that's why they also loved buying Mudgee, apart from that they were close to my mum. You know, that gave him something to really hook into, which was physical. I think he liked keeping active, kept him pretty fit and healthy.
So let's get to France. Who is on the trip and who's your guide?
It was myself, Barney, and my son Angus, who at the time I think was 14. Was also very interested because of my interest with Barney's story. We went in 2013. I knew that going back to French-speaking country, and I don't have a word of French, and Barney's his French isn't as good as it was 50 or 60 years ago. We had the contact there, Christiane Gilbert, who in 1975 was Barney's interpreter as a 19-year-old, and she was best friends with Claudine Sigrist, who was Gabby Mugel's daughter. Gabby was with Barney during his time with the Resistance, and Gabby was the farmer that their farm was overtaken by the Germans, and he hid, and Barney ended up with him. So the daughter Claudine, who was an 18, 19-year-old in 1975 and couldn't speak a word of English, met Barney back then, and her friend, who could speak good English, was the interpreter, and that's Christiane, still a family friend, married to an Australian, and has a daughter living in Turramurra in Sydney. So we flew over into Nice, right to where Gabby Mugel's daughter Claudine lived, in the little village of Biot outside Nice. We flew there and we met up with her, stayed with her, and then we drove up. We picked up Christiane and we did our trip, which was incredible.
So you guys sort of do the reverse of Barney's journey by starting south in La Bresse, and then you head north.
Yeah, we picked up Christiane in Avignon and we drove up. We stayed in Geradmer, which is a bigger town than La Bresse, and there were various things arranged. We had a sort of a civic meeting with the mayor, and TV was there. They interviewed Barney, a civic reception, which was wonderful. And La Bresse is a beautiful town, and it's just beautiful there up in the mountains. It's up in the snow country. Ski fields not far away, and beautiful part of the trip. Where Claudine's dad, Gabby Mugel's farm was, you could pretty much look out of La Bresse up the hill and just about see it, and the Piquant Pierre, which is a lot higher, but it's just a big, distinct valley. La Bresse in the middle and the Piquant Pierre up above. And it is where Barney hid and fought with the Resistance, and there was a lot of atrocities around there. There's a monument at the Piquant Pierre, the big rock, where there's all the names of the people. There was a period there in October 44 where the Germans, I think they were pretty much getting sick of the Resistance in that area, and it was causing them a lot of problems, and they weren't able to stop it. But what they did was, in frustration, they pretty much committed a lot of war crimes. They executed a lot of people, and there was a lot of bad things happened. But the local farming stock there were pretty tough, I think, and they that's why they sort of caused a lot of problems for the Germans. But so one of the interesting things of Barney's time up there and the Piquant Pierre is that it was, because it was so high, it was where they would drop a lot of supplies. The Allies would fly in it 1 or 2 in the morning, and if they got a coded message on the BBC to say the drop would be happening, Barney and the others would go up and set up big bonfires and light them, and then they knew where to drop in the middle of the night.
How's Barney reacting to this, being back there?
Oh, he's, as he always is, he's pretty pragmatic and pretty understated, and he was, I think, just happy to be back there and to go back, as he, I guess, realised maybe the last time, obviously, go back to the places he'd been, which is so close to his heart. He loved the whole experience. When I think about La Bresse too and the civic reception we had, one of the really interesting connections we got by a stroke of luck was they had a bit of an interview with Barney on the local French TV station. Christiane, the following morning after it had been on the news on the local TV, she came down to breakfast and said that she just had a phone call from 2 old guys in their 80s, late 80s, early 90s, that had seen the TV story and knew Barney through their cousin, a fellow by the Mackie name of Bebert, who was with these 2 younger guys. They were a farming family from up near Epinal, I think, and what the Germans were doing were, if there were any males over the age of about 15 or 16, they would round them up and basically send them off to the Eastern Front to fight for the Germans. And so a lot of men were going into hiding. And Bebert, the cousin of these 2 that saw the TV show, he was on the farm and in his late 20s, early 30s, I think, and he got wind of the Germans coming and disappeared. The Germans came out after him, and because he wasn't there, they took one of these boys who were 15 and 13 at the time in 1944, took him away, locked him up, tortured him, tried to get information out of him. I think their names were Max and Lucien, from memory. We went out and met them, and it was very emotional, actually, because they, a bit like Barney not talking about it, they really didn't talk about this much because it was pretty traumatic for them, I think, in 1944, what happened. But yeah, fortunately they lived to tell the tale, and they were very emotional and pleased to meet Barney.
It would have meant a lot to Barney as well, because Bebert was such a significant character in Barney's story, sort of leader of the local cell. And
yeah. Well, their cousin had hidden and sort of run missions, I suppose, and carried on various reconnaissance or whatever activities with Barney. Bebert and Barney were together with a bit of a hodgepodge band of German deserters and local Mackie that were trying to avoid capture at the time. So,
but Bebert did what needed to be done. One time their groups infiltrated almost by a spy, and Barney's amazed when Bebert just shoots him dead and gets Barney to bury the body. I mean, it's an amazing connection to still have 70-ish years later.
Yeah. I think that side of things, it was pretty common. I mean, a lot of French, particularly city French, but a lot of French were, I guess, intimidated by the Germans into changing sides, basically. And I don't know the politics too well, but there was your Vichy, a German sympathisers side, and then the resistance, which I think were mostly sort of the country people that were not going over. So there was often people who were willing to pass on information to the Germans, and so they had a few experiences of that.
So you keep making your way north and get to the crash site. Where is the crash site, and what was that experience like of being back there with Barney?
There's an historical society we linked up with up there, and there was actually an American lady and a couple of French fellows. She used to be in the White House, and she was married to a French guy and lived there and was very passionate about the history and the war cemeteries, because up there, not far from Lagarde, is where all his crewmates are buried in the Chiloy War Cemetery. Yeah, so we went out to Lagarde, which is a very small village. We went out to the crash site, which is just out, it's maybe a K outside the village, not much more or less. Had a look around there, saw the lay of the land. I think a lot of it's very similar to what it was like. Running through that country, there's a loch which runs through from Lagarde to the next little village, Mourcourt, which is where Barney ran to after the plane crashed. And there's just a lot of gently sloping farm fields with stands of forest in amongst it. Actually, one thing that I do remember, which relates to that particular part of his story, I always thought, and probably until about 15 years ago, I thought that Barney actually crashed in Germany proper, until I looked into the story, because he always said he crashed behind the German border. And then when we got to Legarden, I realised that actually the Germans, because they always probably still consider that Alsace region part of Germany, and so I think when they did the Blitzkrieg and they immediately set up a new border, and whether they figured if they ever retreated back, they thought, well, this is where we're going to keep our border, because when Barney crashed and then ran that night through the forest, he came to rows of barbed wire and with sentry posts, which was literally the new German border, which was deserted because by this stage in 44 they were right across France. So there was no one there. He ran not that far, I don't know how far, 5 or 10, 5, 6, 7 Ks from the crash site to Moorcourt, and then that's where he linked up with the local resistance and the lock keeper of the village, who was the resistance leader. He stayed there a few days, and then he was couriered from Moorcourt on a bus to Nancy, where they went into a solicitor's office, I believe, which was right next to Gestapo headquarters in the main square in Nancy, which was thousands of German soldiers, and there was Barney.
They're talking about where they're going to smuggle him to, and Barney's looking out the window, and all these German soldiers just goose-stepping through the courtyard.
That's right. So it must have been surreal.
Oh, I can imagine how surreal it was for Barney standing in that crash site. That photo taken of him standing there is amazing. I mean, geographically speaking, the only thing different is the lack of snow that he parachuted into. Otherwise, it's still all there. It must have been a remarkable experience.
Yeah.
Did he give away any hint of emotion at that point?
Oh, Barney's very... I can hardly recall ever seeing too much emotion with Barney. He keeps it very much under wraps. Although, no, having said that, just in the garden, if he got a problem, he can flip, but that's over menial things. Doesn't really show emotion. And whether he locked that away way back when it all happened, I'm not really sure, or whether it's just the way he is. It's hard to know. I've got a feeling he may have locked it away at that point, because it was such a drastic thing to come down, crash down out of the sky, survive and see all your mates perish. And, you're in your early 20s. So I think I can sort of see how you might lock it away and not have emotion about it.
Well, Barney is the sole survivor. He does see his mates perish. And during this trip, you get to Chiloy War Cemetery and you find the graves of his crew.
Yeah. I found it very emotional, but Barney's very pragmatic. He sort of chatted about the crew, and I'm not sure whether he'd been to the actual war cemetery before. Not really sure. I don't think so, but...
Did you find the graves of all the crew?
They're all there, yep, side by side. And it's quite a touching thing when we were there, because they have all the different sections. They had a Muslim section where all the graves were facing a different way, and then a very large French section. It was obviously the biggest section of the cemetery, I guess. And straight after, not many people probably realise with all of that too, that they've got these big war cemeteries, but by the end of the war, obviously the cemetery wasn't there, and there were bodies. Like, for example, Barney's crew is a good case. They crashed. The Germans were in control of the region, and they came out and found the bodies. The Germans considered, I think, these sort of bomber crews almost as war criminals, because from their perspective, they were having their cities decimated by them.
All the dehousing and the incredible raids Bomber Harris had them doing.
Yeah. So they refused to let the locals bury the crew in the local cemetery. They made them bury them outside the cemetery. This is what I heard. I think that's a true story. And so they were buried there until after the war, and they formed the War Graves Commission, I believe, and then they actually literally went round and retrieved all the bodies they could find and just mapped some central war grave cemeteries around France. So their bodies were moved.
After that emotional day at the cemetery, you guys finished the trip by popping over to London and visiting the Bomber Command Memorial.
And that was again another moving experience. I wasn't aware of it either until I became more involved in the story. How Bomber Command was really, I don't know if vilified's the word, but yeah, during the war and after. And I don't think even Winston Churchill liked Bomber Harris and didn't like what they were doing.
Harris was relentless in his tactics. He just wanted more and more, thinking he could make the Germans capitulate by destroying their spirit when the Germans had failed to do that on Britain. So why would it succeed if Britain was doing it back to the Germans? But
yeah, there's lessons in history which hopefully we're not going to repeat.
Well, I can't imagine what a profound experience that trip would have been for Barney. And like you say, he keeps his cards close to his chest. But you did document the trip very thoroughly on a Facebook page for friends and family, including some fantastic photos and videos.
Yeah.
And what is the name of that Facebook page for listeners to look up?
Oh, it's called Barney in France. It was my first foray into Facebook, I have to admit. A lot of people, including members of my own family, are very critical of Facebook. But in this particular scenario, it was just the perfect way to go around, with your smartphone at hand and just to log the little stories and parts of your trip, so that family could see what you were doing from day to day, almost almost up to the minute, what you were up to without you having to talk to everyone. It was a brilliant one. And it's a record that's there. His whole original story that he recorded pretty much straight after the war is on there, and all the little stories of the people we met. And some of the things that happened around La Bresse, even some of the memorials relating to particular little stories and atrocities that happened and points of interest. It was, it was good.
Lots of little discoveries. Like I knew from a while ago the story of the doctor Barney goes to visit. Then during that trip, I learned via your Facebook page that we get to know the fate of the doctor and how he was imprisoned and eventually killed during the war by the Germans, and documenting moments like, you've got a 90-second video of Barney at the cemetery, which is amazingly insightful to watch and tap into.
Yeah, that's right.
So let's fast forward a couple of years from that trip. Barney is featured prominently in a documentary on himself and 11 of his schoolmates for School and Country. And during the research for that doco is when you and I first get in contact. And then that documentary has now led to a book about Barney.
It's been, I'm personally very grateful to you guys, because it's his story, another one, all the podcasts and these things you're doing. It's a very precious thing to record these things and remember what all these people do at these times of war and so on. It's good that you do it.
I think Barney was the real kickstart inspiration for Angus Horton and I, because Barney was the second veteran for that documentary we interviewed. And we got a great story with the first guy and thought, okay, we're onto something good here. And then Barney's story was the second we recorded and just, of course, blew us away. And then we kept collecting more and more and realised we have to do more with this. And then when an opportunity for a book came along, we had to pick a story. Barney's just, there's something so special about it. And then it's just led us further and further down this path. So we're, of course, feel very grateful to Barney, and it's our privilege to help tell his story in any way that we can and be involved. And now the biography of Barney Greatrex, which is called Barney Greatrex, From Bomber Command to the French Resistance, the stirring story of an Australian hero, is by Michael Veitch. It's out now. And thank you, Charlie. Michael and I were constantly in touch with you about new information, photos, and that kind of thing, and you were a massive help in the project.
Well, it was an easy thing to want to support. For me, in the background of it all, as well as remembering what Barney went through, was just remembering his crew and also the people of La Bresse and France, where he was and what they went through. To me, it's sort of a remembrance of that as much as it is of Barney in particular.
You got to read a proof copy of the book on behalf of the family, and you took the proof copy and read it to now 97-year-old Barney. How did he react to it?
He loved it. I think, at 97, at this stage of his life, it just brought back memories, and he loved it. Yeah, it was really good.
Because, like you say, Barney can be very pragmatic, and I see him most get excited when Kate comes out, or when, his story is getting, he's really enjoyed getting the attention for his story in a deserving, rightfully so way. A couple of times we've taken him to school assemblies and he sees all the interest and adoration from a crowd that got him excited. I remember on Remembrance Day 2011, 11, we took Barney to his old school, Knox, and he spoke to an assembly of some of the younger boys. He was loving it, and then afterwards he's chatting with some of the senior boys from that group, and we're taking a photo, and he just cracks a smile and says, "Make sure you get this in the yearbook."
Yeah.
The little moments shine through, and when one of those times you were reading the proof copy, you filmed a couple of minutes of you reading it to him and just had the camera on Barney, and you emailed it, and I was so glad you did, because seeing a raw emotional reaction from Barney, he was just so animated by hearing you read back to him, and then Barney did this, and then Collins did that. It was fantastic.
Yeah. Oh no, he loved it. He just soaked it in. So I loved it was a real privilege to be able to do what I've done with Barney, going back to France, and just over the years being able to absorb the story with him and relate it back to him. And so the book's very precious for that. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. And I think the 2013 trip is an integral part of his story. It's brought things full circle in a way, and we get to close out and celebrate that with the book and the Legion of Honor last year. And it's just fantastic to see this celebration in the latter stages of a wonderful life. So it's been a privilege for myself to get to know Barney these past many years and to help tell his story. And thank you, Charlie, for helping us tell the story, and thanks for your time today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, and thanks for everything you guys have done. We really appreciate it as a family.
That was my conversation with Charlie Mort about his uncle, Barney Greatrex. Barney Greatrex by Michael Veitch, based on research by Lloyd and Angus Horton, is out now where all good books are sold. You can look up more information about it on our website, www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. A shameless plug, it's the perfect Christmas present. You can also learn more about the documentary starring Barney at forschoolandcountry.com. This is our last episode of Season 1 of Life on the Line, but we'll be back in the first half of next year. Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast in your podcast app to know when we're back. Also, keep in touch on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Life on the Line Podcast, and on Twitter at LOTLPod. And write to us by emailing podcast@lifeonthelinepodcast.com. And if you know a veteran serviceman or servicewoman with a story to tell, please get in touch. We would love to have them on Season 2 of the podcast. Our artwork is by the talented Mark Thacker at Big Cat Design. Our music is by Dan Van Werkhoven, composer and author extraordinaire at Mark IV Multimedia. That's a 4 in Roman numerals. Dan was also our lead composer on For School and Country. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Of that team, particular thanks go to Angus Horton and Thomas Kay for making this season possible. Thanks also go to Ashley Barton and Kate Sherrington for advice and support. I'm Alex Lloyd, and it's been a pleasure having you with us for Season 1 of Life on the Line. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget. Life on the Line is still off-season. We will be back next month, but I had to break silence to share some sad news. Barnaby Ryder Greatrex, known as Barney, was a veteran of the Second World War. He was born on 9 April 1920, and he passed away on Saturday, 17 February 2018. It was peaceful, and he had his niece, Margaret, by his side. Regular listeners of this podcast will recognise Barney's name. He's been brought up on the show a lot. We spent a lot of time with Barney and his story, and it means a lot to us at Thistle Productions. For those hearing of Barney for the first time, Barney Greatrex joined the Royal Australian Air Force in 1941 and flew 20 missions over Europe as a Lancaster bomb aimer for Bomber Command. On his 20th mission in February 1944, he was shot down over occupied France. The only survivor of the crash, he went on to join the French resistance in the fight against Nazi Germany for 8 months until the country was liberated. To commemorate his passing, here are a couple of highlights from his story, told by the man himself, This interview was with Angus Horton, with me behind the camera, on 13 May 2011.
We left Coningsby at about 7 p.m. and flew towards Paris. The sky was was hazy. We were going to Augsburg. We got about halfway between Paris and Strasbourg, and we knew that we were being followed by a German plane. We tried to, we did evasive action, but it didn't make any difference. And I remember the rear gunner saying, look, we've got to do something because it's getting nearer and nearer. Then I looked out the window at the front of the Lancaster and I could see engine on the starboard side had caught fire. So that was obviously the beginning of the end. And the pilot said, abandon ship, I think. And it went into a corkscrew. It was at about 25,000 feet, so it was quite high up. But it got into a corkscrew, which got faster and faster. And the escape hatch, or the main escape hatch, was underneath me. So I'd pulled it up, which was quite a business. I mean, it sounds simple to do, but once the plane gets into a corkscrew, it absolutely overcomes your movements if you're not very careful. It took some seconds to come up, and we had at Coningsby, we'd all been to another place and we'd all dropped off a tower and tested the parachute arrangements, you see. And you had to wait, first of all, about 3 or 4 seconds after you left the plane. And of course, once you left the plane, there was no noise at all. It was all silent. So you'd count up to about 4 or 5 and then pull the ripcord. And if all went right, you'd be right. It went right and it opened. We'd learnt to land by folding up our legs and sort of collapsing on the thing. The ground was covered in a very light layer of snow, so it sort of helped. I got up and walked away from the plane, crashed almost behind me.
In the next clip, Barney recounts a close encounter he and his French resistance cell had with a spy. The spy worked for the Vichy French, collaborators with the Nazis.
The resistance was controlled by de Gaulle from London, but Vichy was the German side of the thing. And to cut a story short, this man, we'd gone straight to the local police and got this man's background because the local police were all resistance people. And they said, look, he's a spy. He's a Vichy spy. Do what you like with him. Words like that. And he came and one day and introduced himself to Bébert. This is the leader of us. And Bébert sort of whispered to me, leave it to me, we'll have to deal with him. And before I knew what had happened, they'd shot him dead. And we had to bury him, which was a hell of a job because we didn't have a spade. We had to go to a farmhouse and get spades and go through all this rigmarole. And
that ground was pretty frozen.
Well, the ground was, it was partly snow-covered and in a mess. And it shook me. I was amazed, but Bébert had been in the Foreign Legion, so he had complete control of the thing.
After the war, Barney married Jenny, who passed away in 2014. The pair were a wonderful uncle and aunt to the many children of Barney's siblings, Anthony and Pleasance. Barney worked for his father's engineering business, running it himself for many years before passing it on to the next generation. Thank you for your service, Barney Greatrex. It was an honour to call you a friend. May you rest in peace.